On the day Princess Eliana was supposed to become engaged to a prince, she disappeared before the ceremony even began. By sunset, her father had stripped her of her royal title, her inheritance, and her place in the line of succession. The entire kingdom believed she had thrown away her future for a poor old woman lying alone in the snow. But nobody knew the truth. That helpless old woman was carrying a secret that had been hidden inside the royal palace for 20 years. A secret connected to the death of Eliana's mother. And by saving that woman, the princess would unknowingly expose the greatest betrayal in the history of her kingdom. 22 years earlier, Princess Eliana had been born into a world where every part of her future had already been decided. Her father, King Edric, believed that a future monarch could not be allowed to live like an ordinary person. Every lesson had a purpose. Every friendship was observed. Every public appearance was carefully planned. Eliana had studied diplomacy, economics, military history, foreign languages, agriculture, law, and royal tradition. She knew the names of distant nobles and could explain the trade routes connecting Aurelia to its neighboring kingdoms. She had been trained to understand the weight of a crown before she was old enough to understand the meaning of freedom. Yet there was one part of her character that her father considered troublesome. Eliana could never walk past someone in need. When servants became sick, she secretly visited them. When farmers came to the palace seeking help after poor harvests, she remembered their names. When children were injured during festivals, she stopped whatever ceremony was taking place to make certain they received care. King Edric believed such compassion could become dangerous. A ruler had to make difficult decisions, and difficult decisions sometimes required ignoring individual suffering for the sake of a larger political goal. Eliana understood his reasoning, but she never fully accepted it. Her mother, Queen Seraphine, had been different. Before her death, she had encouraged Eliana to remain kind even when kindness was inconvenient. Seraphine had died when Eliana was only 4, leaving behind little more than fragments of memory and a small silver pendant that Eliana still wore beneath her clothing. Over the years, King Edric rarely spoke about his wife. He described her death as a tragic illness and discouraged anyone from discussing it further. Eliana therefore grew up believing that her mother's life belonged to the distant past. On this particular morning, however, the memory of Seraphine would quietly influence everything that followed. The engagement was not a romantic arrangement. Prince Adrian of Belmont was the heir to a neighboring kingdom, and the marriage had been negotiated for years. Their union would strengthen the northern border, increase trade, and end a political rivalry that had occasionally threatened to become a war. Adrian was considered an excellent match. He was educated, disciplined, wealthy, and respected by his people. Eliana did not dislike him, but neither did she know him well enough to imagine spending the rest of her life with him. She accepted the arrangement because she had been taught that royal duty came before personal preference. On the morning of the ceremony, She entered her carriage wearing a magnificent silver gown. Her hair had been carefully arranged, and a delicate crown waited beside her. The palace bells announced the approaching ceremony as the procession began moving through the eastern gate. Eliana should have been thinking about the vows, the ambassadors, and the political future of Aurelia. Instead, she noticed something on the side of the road. A broken wooden cart had overturned beside a frozen ditch. Several sacks of grain had spilled into the snow. An elderly woman lay nearby, struggling to move. Her clothing was thin, her hands were uncovered, and her face was almost completely hidden beneath wet gray hair. A few people had gathered around her, but nobody seemed willing to interfere. The royal guards were trying to clear the road so the procession could continue. Eliana looked through the carriage window and watched the old woman attempt to rise. She fell back into the snow. The procession continued for several moments. Then Eliana noticed that the woman's hands had begun turning pale from the cold. She knew that if the woman remained there much longer, she might not survive. The carriage was already late. The ceremony could not be delayed. Hundreds of important people were waiting. Her father would be furious if she caused a scene. Yet Eliana remembered something her mother had once taught her. The value of a person's life did not depend on whether anyone important was watching. Eliana ordered the carriage to stop. The guards hesitated. The attendants protested. The musicians continued toward the palace because they had not yet realized what was happening. Eliana stepped into the snow wearing the gown that had been prepared for her engagement. She removed her own cloak and wrapped it around the old woman. She helped lift her into the carriage and ordered the driver to take them to the nearest clinic. By the time Eliana arrived at the small village medical house, the grand hall was already full. Prince Adrian had entered. The ambassadors were seated. King Edric stood beneath the royal crest. The clock passed noon. Eliana was not there. The ceremony ended without her. Within an hour, rumors spread throughout the capital. Some believed she had fled. Others claimed she had insulted Belmont deliberately. By evening, King Edric had made his decision. Eliana returned to the palace expecting anger, but instead found guards waiting at the entrance. Her father refused to receive her as his daughter. An official decree announced that Princess Eliana had abandoned her royal duty and would no longer be recognized as heir. Her name was removed from the succession register. Her allowance was suspended. She was ordered to leave before sunrise. Eliana walked through the palace gates carrying one small bag. The crown remained behind. The engagement ring remained behind. Her future remained behind. Yet she did not regret saving the woman. She did not know that the old stranger was carrying a secret capable of changing the kingdom. She did not know that the woman had once served inside the palace. She did not know that she had spent 20 years protecting evidence connected to Queen Seraphine's mysterious death. Eliana believed she had sacrificed her future for a stranger. In reality, she had just stepped directly into the truth her mother had died trying to protect. Eliana spent the first night after leaving the palace in a small farmhouse several miles from the capital. The family who owned it had once received assistance from the crown after a disastrous harvest, and although they were shocked to discover who their guest really was, they did not treat her like a fallen princess. They gave her a warm room, simple food, and a place near the fire. For the first time in her life, Eliana experienced a strange freedom. Nobody was watching how she sat. Nobody corrected her clothing. Nobody reminded her that every action could become political. Yet the freedom was accompanied by a painful uncertainty. She had spent 22 years preparing for a future that had disappeared in a single afternoon. She did not know where she would live, what she would become, or whether her father would ever forgive her. Her only clear responsibility was the old woman she had saved. The woman had been taken to the village clinic and remained unconscious for most of the night. The physician believed she had suffered severe exposure to the cold and exhaustion. When she finally woke, she appeared confused but surprisingly calm. Her name was Mara. She was 71 years old and had lived alone for many years in a small village north of the capital. She earned a modest living repairing clothing, collecting herbs, and making small handmade objects for the local market. She had no husband, no children nearby, and no wealth. To everyone who knew her, she was simply an old, poor woman whose life had been difficult. But Eliana quickly discovered that Mara was not as ordinary as she appeared. She knew the palace. She knew the royal roads. She knew the names of people who had died decades earlier. Most strangely, she knew details about Queen Seraphine. Mara knew that Seraphine preferred blue flowers in spring. She knew which books the queen had kept beside her bed. She knew about a small silver pendant that Seraphine had given to Eliana when she was a child. These details could not have come from rumors. Eventually, Mara revealed that she had once worked inside the royal palace. She had been one of Queen Seraphine's personal seamstresses and had remained close to her for several years. She had left the palace shortly before Seraphine died. Mara had spent the decades since then living quietly because she had been afraid of powerful people who wanted certain truths to remain buried. She possessed a wooden box that she had carried with her for 20 years. Inside were old letters, financial records, a faded royal seal, and a portrait of Queen Seraphine holding young Eliana. Mara had protected the box because she had promised the queen that one day the truth would reach her daughter. Eliana studied the documents carefully. They revealed that Seraphine had discovered serious corruption within the royal administration during the final year of her life. Several officials had been secretly diverting money from the treasury through false trade contracts. The payments appeared to be connected to merchants who did little real work but received enormous sums from the crown. Seraphine had begun collecting evidence and had planned to bring it directly to King Edric. Before she could complete the investigation, she became mysteriously ill. Her condition deteriorated quickly, and she died before the investigation was ever presented to the king. After her death, the official records disappeared. Mara had suspected that someone inside the palace had removed them. She had therefore kept copies of the documents that Seraphine had secretly entrusted to her. Eliana struggled to understand why her mother had never been able to expose the corruption. The answer became clearer when Mara revealed the name of the official who appeared repeatedly in the documents. Lord Varick was the king's most trusted minister. He had served Edric for more than 15 years and had gradually gained control over the treasury, trade offices, and royal administration. He was admired for his intelligence and discipline. If the evidence was genuine, he had been using that trust to control the kingdom from inside the government. There was another discovery that frightened Eliana even more. Seraphine had secretly created a legal document concerning Eliana's future succession. The document stated that if King Edric ever became incapable of ruling, the crown would pass directly to Eliana without requiring approval from the royal council. Several powerful nobles had opposed this arrangement because they feared that a young queen might refuse to follow traditional political expectations. The engagement with Prince Adrian suddenly looked different. It was no longer simply a diplomatic marriage. It might also have been an attempt to control the future queen before she inherited the throne. Eliana did not accuse her father immediately. She knew that the evidence had to be verified. If she returned to the palace without proof, Varick could easily portray her as a disgraced daughter seeking revenge. Mara suggested that they visit Father Lucian, an elderly scholar who had once advised Queen Seraphine. He lived in a monastery in the northern hills and had withdrawn from politics many years earlier. Eliana, Mara, and a small group of trusted travelers began the journey. Along the road, Eliana saw villages she had rarely visited during her royal life. She saw families struggling with taxes, farmers repairing broken irrigation channels without government support, and merchants complaining about contracts that always seemed to favor the same wealthy companies. The kingdom looked prosperous from the palace, but outside the capital, many people were quietly suffering. Father Lucian examined the documents and confirmed that Seraphine's handwriting was authentic. He also recognized the names of several officials involved in the financial network. Yet he warned Eliana that evidence was not enough. Varick controlled too many institutions. If he discovered that Mara was alive and that the documents had survived, he would destroy every remaining record and silence anyone who could confirm the truth. Unfortunately, Varick did discover their movements. One of his informants saw Mara near the monastery. Search parties began moving through the northern villages. Eliana realized that hiding would no longer protect them. She decided to return to the capital and expose the corruption publicly. She had already lost her title, her inheritance, and her father's trust. There was nothing left for her to protect, accept the truth. The journey back to Aurelia was dangerous, but Eliana was no longer traveling as a princess trying to reclaim her position. She was traveling as a woman who had discovered that the kingdom she was supposed to inherit was in greater danger than she had ever imagined. And somewhere behind the palace walls, the people responsible were beginning to realize that the daughter they had dismissed had become their greatest threat. Eliana returned to the capital secretly several weeks after her disownment. She did not enter through the main gates. She traveled through the poorer districts and stayed with families who had no connection to the royal court. This allowed her to see Aurelia without the protection of ceremony. The experience changed her understanding of her kingdom. She discovered that the suffering she had once seen from palace balconies was much larger than she had imagined. Farmers had been forced to borrow money because government taxes had increased. Small merchants were losing contracts to companies connected to royal officials. Families were paying more for grain, while wealthy suppliers received generous payments from the treasury. None of these problems were obvious inside the palace, because reports reaching the king had been carefully prepared to make the kingdom appear stable. Eliana began collecting evidence. She did not have royal authority anymore, so she depended on ordinary people. A baker provided copies of grain contracts. A farmer showed her tax records. A former treasury clerk revealed that several financial documents had been altered after receiving orders from senior officials. A merchant secretly provided information about companies that existed only on paper. Every piece seemed small by itself, but together they formed a pattern. Money was being removed from the kingdom through a network of false contracts. Lord Varric appeared near the center of almost every transaction. Yet Eliana still lacked the evidence necessary to prove that he had deliberately organized the corruption. Father Lucian advised her to search for the original treasury records. If the original documents could be found, the alterations would become obvious. Eliana spent days searching old archives. Eventually, she discovered a sealed collection of records from the final year of Queen Seraphine's life. Among them was a payment authorized shortly after Seraphine's death. The signature appeared to belong to King Edric. Eliana was devastated. Until that moment, she had believed that her father had simply been manipulated by Varric. Now she feared that he might have been involved in the conspiracy. Mara warned her not to judge too quickly. Father Lucian compared the document with other records and discovered something unusual. The payment had not been made to a corrupt merchant. It had been sent to a group of private investigators. Edric had secretly hired them to investigate the circumstances surrounding Seraphine's death. Varric had intercepted the investigation and redirected the money through his own financial network. This discovery revealed the truth about Edric's behavior. The king had suspected that something was wrong, but he had never found enough evidence to confront his own minister. Over time, Varric had convinced him that stability depended upon controlling Eliana's future. The engagement to Adrian had therefore been promoted as a political necessity. Edric had believed that securing Belmont's support would protect Aurelia. Varric had understood that the arrangement would also give him influence over both kingdoms. Eliana felt a painful mixture of anger and sympathy toward her father. He had made terrible choices, but he had not caused the corruption. He had simply allowed fear to make him dependent on the wrong people. Before Eliana could organize the evidence, Varric learned that she was back in the capital. He accused her of conspiring against the crown and ordered the palace guard to arrest her. Eliana could have escaped. Several friends offered her a safe route out of the city. She refused. Running would allow Varric to claim that she had been guilty. She decided to enter the palace voluntarily and force the truth into the open. The guards escorted her through the same gates she had walked through months earlier after being disowned. The difference was that she no longer felt like a frightened daughter. She understood the system around her. She knew how power moved through the palace. She knew which people were loyal to the king and which were loyal to Varric. She also knew that Mara and Father Lucian had copies of the evidence outside the palace. If she disappeared, the documents would eventually reach the public. When Eliana entered the royal council chamber, King Edric was seated beneath the crown. Lord Varric stood beside him. Several nobles watched from their seats. Everyone expected Eliana to defend herself against the accusation of abandoning her royal duty. Instead, she placed the evidence collected from villages, merchants, former officials, and palace archives before the council. The documents were examined one by one. The financial records showed impossible payments. The merchant contracts revealed companies with no legitimate operations. The original documents exposed alterations made in official records. The testimony of former officials connected the transactions to people working directly under Varric. The council slowly realized that the corruption could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Varric attempted to discredit the witnesses, but the number of independent sources made that increasingly difficult. Eliana then presented the final evidence from Queen Seraphine. The letter had been hidden inside the wooden box Mara had protected for 2 decades. It described the Queen's fear that the kingdom was being controlled by people who convinced the king that fear was the same thing as wisdom. It also described her hope that Eliana would someday understand that leadership was not about preserving appearances. It was about protecting people who had no power to protect themselves. The meaning of the letter became impossible to ignore. The decision Eliana had made on the snowy road had followed exactly the principle her mother had hoped to pass to her daughter. King Edric finally understood what his daughter had done. She had not abandoned the crown. She had acted according to the responsibility that the crown was supposed to represent. Lord Varric was arrested before the council ended. Several officials connected to him were detained for investigation. But the crisis was not over. The corruption had existed for years, and removing one man would not repair the damage. Eliana knew that Aurelia needed more than punishment. It needed reform. She also knew that before she could help rebuild the kingdom, she had to decide whether she still wanted the crown that had once been taken from her. The investigation continued for months. Once Lord Veric lost control of the treasury, hidden records began appearing from offices across the kingdom. Officials who had remained silent for years finally came forward. Some had been threatened. Others had been bribed. A few had participated willingly because they believed the corruption would never be discovered. The financial damage was enormous, but the greater damage was the loss of public trust. King Edric had ruled Aurelia for many years, believing that his government was strong. Now he discovered that the palace had been surrounded by people who had learned how to manipulate his decisions. He had trusted Veric because Veric always presented himself as the person protecting the kingdom from instability. In reality, he had created instability and then used fear of that instability to gain more power. The investigation also revealed the truth about Queen Seraphine's final months. She had not been murdered directly, but the corruption around her had prevented her from receiving the proper medical care and had caused important information about her illness to disappear. Her death had been allowed to remain unexplained because those responsible knew that reopening the case might expose their financial crimes. King Edric was devastated. For 20 years, he had believed that he had lost his wife to an unavoidable illness. He now understood that his own failure to question the people around him had allowed the truth to remain hidden. His relationship with Eliana was even more painful. He had disowned his daughter because she had embarrassed him in front of foreign royalty. He had treated her action as a betrayal of the crown. Yet the same action had ultimately exposed the people who had been stealing from the kingdom. Eliana did not immediately forgive him. She understood his fear, but understanding did not erase the pain caused by his decision. She had spent weeks believing she was no longer his daughter. She had learned how to live without royal protection. She had discovered strength she never knew she possessed. Their relationship, therefore, had to be rebuilt slowly. King Edric offered to restore her title immediately. Eliana accepted the restoration of her name, but refused to return to the palace as though nothing had happened. She asked to travel throughout Aurelia and study the problems caused by the corrupt administration. The king agreed. During the following months, Eliana visited villages, farms, schools, markets, and hospitals. She listened to people who had never been invited into the royal court. She learned that some problems had nothing to do with Veric. Roads had been ignored because officials preferred funding grand projects near the capital. Farmers had been forced into debt because irrigation systems were outdated. Widows struggled because inheritance laws favored powerful families. Children in remote villages had no access to reliable education. Eliana began developing reforms based on what she saw. She established independent financial oversight so no single minister could control the treasury. She ordered royal contracts to become public records. She created protections for witnesses who exposed corruption. She expanded medical services outside the capital and directed funds toward rebuilding rural infrastructure. She also changed the way the royal court communicated with the people. Instead of waiting for reports from local officials, representatives were sent directly to villages to gather information. These changes were not universally popular. Some nobles opposed them because they had benefited from the old system. Several accused Eliana of trying to weaken the aristocracy. She continued anyway. Prince Adrian also returned to Belmont with a different understanding of the failed engagement. He had discovered that several advisors in his own kingdom had supported the marriage because they expected Belmont to gain influence over Aurelia's trade routes. Adrian refused to participate in the plan. Instead of ending the relationship between the kingdoms, he proposed a new alliance based on transparent trade agreements and mutual protection. For the first time, Aurelia and Belmont were able to cooperate without using marriage as the foundation of their political relationship. Eliana and Adrian remained in contact, but their relationship was no longer controlled by royal expectations. They became friends first. Their connection developed slowly because both understood the danger of allowing politics to determine personal decisions. Meanwhile, Mara was invited to live near the palace. She refused a noble title, but accepted a small house in the royal gardens. She spent her days tending flowers and teaching young palace workers the history she had once been afraid to reveal. Her presence became a quiet reminder of the truth that had changed Aurelia. The woman who had once been invisible now walked through the palace without fear. Eliana visited her often. Mara became one of the few people who could remind the future queen that power was not measured by how many people bowed when she entered a room. It was measured by how many people were safer because she had entered it. One winter evening, King Edric visited Eliana in the gardens. He no longer approached her as a father giving instructions to a daughter. He approached her as a king seeking advice from the person who would inherit his responsibilities. Their relationship had changed. Edric admitted, through his actions and his willingness to listen, that he had been wrong about compassion. He had believed that a ruler needed distance to make difficult decisions. Eliana had shown him that distance could also make a ruler blind. Edric began preparing her for the throne differently. He taught her how to negotiate with people who disagreed with her. He showed her how to recognize manipulation. He encouraged her to question reports rather than accept them because they came from trusted officials. Most importantly, he stopped trying to control the woman she was becoming. 1 year after the engagement she had missed, the kingdom was ready for a new ceremony. It would not be a marriage. It would be the formal restoration of Eliana's position as heir and the beginning of a new era for Aurelia. The grand hall was prepared again. The same place where she had been expected to enter as a bride would now receive her as the future queen. But this time, the guest list was different. Farmers, teachers, merchants, doctors, and representatives from remote villages were invited alongside nobles and ambassadors. Eliana understood the symbolism. A year earlier, the hall had been prepared to unite 2 royal families. Now it would be used to recognize the relationship between a ruler and the people she was expected to serve. When Eliana entered the hall, she wore a simple ivory dress rather than the silver gown from the failed engagement. Her father waited beneath the crown. Mara sat among the honored guests. Prince Adrian stood with the delegation from Belmont. The past was still present, but it no longer controlled the future. Eliana accepted her restored position, knowing that the crown would bring new responsibilities. She also understood that she was no longer the young princess who believed obedience was the same thing as duty. She had learned to question, to listen, to act, and to accept the consequences of her choices. The ceremony ended with the kingdom beginning a new chapter. Yet Eliana's greatest journey was still ahead. The years that followed transformed Aurelia more deeply than anyone at the original engagement ceremony could have imagined. The reforms Eliana had begun continued to spread across the kingdom. Government accounts became transparent. Royal contracts were reviewed by independent officials. Rural clinics received regular funding. Farmers gained access to improved irrigation systems. Schools were established in villages that had previously been ignored. The royal court became less isolated from ordinary life. Eliana insisted that representatives from different communities be included in major policy discussions. She believed that a kingdom could not be understood from inside a palace. The changes were not immediate, and many difficulties remained. Some nobles resisted. Some officials complained that the new system made their work harder. There were years when harvests failed, and years when political disagreements threatened to divide the council. But the kingdom had developed something it had lacked before: a system that could correct itself. King Edric gradually transferred more responsibilities to Eliana. He remained respected, but his health was beginning to weaken. He had become quieter with age. He spent more time in the gardens and less time in the council chamber. His relationship with his daughter was now one of mutual trust. He no longer feared her independence. He understood that the greatest protection for a kingdom was not a ruler who controlled everything, but a ruler who surrounded herself with people capable of telling her when she was wrong. Eliana also changed. The princess who had once been uncomfortable outside the palace became known for traveling without elaborate ceremonies. She visited farms during harvest season. She entered village schools without warning. She inspected clinics and spoke with workers. She often traveled to the same areas where she had once seen people struggling with problems hidden from royal reports. Her presence encouraged officials to solve problems before they became disasters. Mara remained close to her. The old woman eventually became a symbol of Aurelia's transformation. Artists painted portraits of her. Historians wrote about her role in preserving Queen Seraphine's evidence. Yet Mara remained uncomfortable with attention. She preferred the quiet life she had lived before, becoming part of royal history. Eliana respected that. She understood that Mara had never wanted power. She had wanted the truth to survive. Prince Adrian also remained part of Eliana's life. Their relationship developed gradually and naturally. They spent years working together through diplomatic meetings and joint projects between Aurelia and Belmont. Neither kingdom needed a royal marriage anymore. Their alliance had become strong enough to survive without it. Eventually, however, something changed between them. They discovered that their connection was no longer based only on friendship. They understood each other's responsibilities, fears, and ambitions. Most importantly, they respected each other's independence. When Adrian finally became king of Belmont, he did not ask Eliana to become part of his kingdom. Instead, he waited for her to decide what she wanted. Eliana did not answer immediately. She had learned the value of making choices slowly. Several years later, they chose to marry. The wedding was intentionally smaller than the engagement ceremony that had once been planned for them. There was no political pressure. No treaty depended upon it. No minister had designed it. Their kingdoms were already allies. The marriage existed because two people had freely chosen each other, after years of knowing exactly what responsibility could demand. King Edric watched the ceremony with quiet pride. He remembered the morning he had believed his daughter had destroyed her future. He now understood that she had protected it. Mara attended the wedding and wore a simple blue dress. She carried the same wooden box that had once contained Queen Seraphine's letters. The box was empty now. The evidence had been preserved in the royal archives, and the original documents had become part of Aurelia's history. Yet Mara had kept the box because it reminded her of the promise she had finally fulfilled. After the wedding, Eliana returned to the road where her life had changed. The place looked completely different. A medical center had been built nearby. A shelter stood beside the road for travelers caught in winter storms. The broken cart was gone. The area had become a small community center serving several surrounding villages. Eliana stood there with Mara and remembered the girl she had been. She remembered wearing a silver gown in the snow. She remembered the royal carriage waiting. She remembered the old woman lying helplessly beside the road. She remembered believing that she was choosing between one human life and her royal duty. She now understood that the two had never been opposites. The purpose of her future crown was precisely to protect people whose suffering could easily be ignored. The road became a personal symbol of her reign. Whenever she faced a difficult political decision, she remembered that moment. It reminded her that statistics represented real people. Reports represented real families. Taxes represented real meals. Policies represented real lives. The lesson was simple, but it was one she had learned at enormous personal cost. A ruler could never understand a kingdom if the ruler only listened to people inside the palace. Years later, King Edric became seriously ill. Eliana remained beside him during his final months. Their relationship had never completely erased the pain of the past, but they had learned to live beyond it. Before his death, Edric formally transferred the crown to Eliana. She became Queen of Aurelia in a quiet ceremony. There was no political crisis. No rival challenged her claim. The kingdom accepted her because they had already watched her lead for years. Her coronation was held in the same grand hall where she had once been expected to become engaged. The room was filled with the same banners and ancient symbols, but the meaning had changed. Eliana entered wearing a simple crown. She looked toward the place where she had once stood, waiting for a ceremony that never happened. She understood that the most important day of her life had not been her coronation. It had been the day she walked away from that ceremony to help a stranger. The crown merely recognized what that decision had already revealed. Eliana became known as one of Aurelia's most respected rulers. Her reign was not remembered for military conquest or enormous wealth. It was remembered for restoring trust. She created institutions that could survive after her death. She encouraged future leaders to listen to people without power. She made the royal archives accessible to historians so that uncomfortable truths would not disappear again. She also preserved the memory of Queen Seraphine. Her mother's story was no longer a mystery hidden behind palace walls. It became a reminder that courage could survive even when the person who first showed it was gone. Eliana had once believed that her mother was only a memory. She eventually understood that Seraphine's greatest legacy was not a crown. It was the principle she had planted in her daughter. A ruler must never become so concerned with preserving appearances that she forgets the people beneath them. And Eliana never forgot. Many years after the day Eliana missed her royal engagement, the story had become one of the most beloved stories in Aurelia. Children heard it from their parents. Teachers used it when explaining the history of the kingdom. Historians described it as the event that began the great reforms of the royal government. Yet the official records told only part of the story. They recorded the corruption, the investigation, the reforms, the restoration of the princess, and her eventual coronation. They recorded the political consequences of the failed engagement and the alliance that later developed between Aurelia and Belmont. But they could never fully record the private transformation that happened inside Eliana herself. She had once believed that her life was already decided. She would become queen, marry a prince, follow royal traditions, and spend the rest of her life protecting a system she had never been allowed to question. The old woman on the snowy road changed all of that. She taught Eliana that a person's value could not be measured by wealth, title, or political usefulness. Mara had been poor, old, and forgotten. Yet she carried a truth that could save an entire kingdom. Eliana had been a princess with everything the world could offer, yet she had been one decision away from becoming trapped inside a life chosen entirely by others. Their meeting changed both of them. Mara survived because Eliana stopped. Eliana discovered her purpose because Mara survived. The connection between those two events became the foundation of a new Aurelia. King Edric lived long enough to see the reforms become permanent. In his final years, he spent much of his time away from formal politics. He visited villages with Eliana and watched her speak with people who once would never have been allowed near the royal court. He saw schools bearing his wife's name. He saw medical centers built in communities that had once been ignored. He saw farmers receiving fair contracts and merchants operating without political favoritism. His greatest satisfaction was not the knowledge that his daughter had become queen. It was the knowledge that she had become a better ruler than he had been. Their relationship remained imperfect, but it became honest. Edric had once disowned Eliana because he believed she had abandoned the crown. In the end, he understood that she had saved the meaning of the crown from becoming empty. Mara lived to an old age. She continued visiting the medical center beside the road where Eliana had found her. The center eventually became a large hospital serving thousands of people. A small garden stood beside the original building. In the center was a stone sculpture showing a young woman placing a cloak around an elderly stranger in the snow. No names were carved into it. Eliana had insisted that the memorial should not celebrate royalty. It should celebrate the choice itself. The message was simple. Compassion should not require an audience. One winter morning, years after her coronation, Queen Eliana visited the garden alone. Snow covered the paths. The same kind of cold wind moved through the trees as it had on the morning of the engagement. She stood beside the sculpture and remembered everything. She remembered the silver gown. She remembered the carriage. She remembered the clock moving toward noon. She remembered the palace doors closing behind her that night. She remembered the fear of having no future. She remembered Mara's wooden box and the first letter from her mother. She remembered the day the truth finally entered the council chamber. She remembered her father's face when he understood what she had done. She remembered the first time she entered the grand hall again as the restored heir. She remembered becoming queen. And she remembered that none of those moments would have happened if she had simply continued toward the engagement ceremony. It was impossible to know what would have happened if she had ignored the old woman. Perhaps the engagement would have succeeded. Perhaps she would have married Adrian immediately. Perhaps the corruption would have remained hidden for another decade. Perhaps Aurelia would have become weaker under Varric's influence. Perhaps Seraphine's final message would never have been discovered. Perhaps Eliana would have spent her entire life believing that obedience was the same thing as goodness. History could never answer those questions. It could only remember the decision she actually made. She had stopped. She had helped someone who could give her nothing in return. She had accepted the consequences. And because she did, an entire kingdom changed. The greatest irony was that Eliana's father had believed the old woman was worthless. He had considered the missed engagement a humiliation. because he could see only the political importance of the ceremony and not the human importance of the woman lying in the snow. But that woman had carried the truth of his own family. She had preserved the memory of his wife. She had protected the evidence that eventually saved his kingdom. The person everyone ignored had become the person who changed history. Eliana often remembered that lesson whenever she faced difficult choices as queen. She understood that important decisions rarely announced themselves. They did not always arrive inside council chambers. They did not always come with royal seals and official documents. Sometimes they appeared as a sick child, a struggling farmer, a frightened widow, a poor worker, or an old woman nobody believed was important. A ruler had to recognize their value before the world recognized it for them. That became the central principle of Eliana's reign. She never promised that Aurelia would become a perfect kingdom. She knew that no kingdom could be perfect. There would always be poverty, disagreement, mistakes, and difficult choices. But she created a system in which people could speak, evidence could be examined, corruption could be challenged, and those without power could still be heard. Her greatest achievement was not becoming queen. It was making sure that the kingdom would not depend entirely on the character of one ruler. When Eliana finally died many years later, the kingdom did not collapse. The institutions she had created continued. The schools remained open. The hospitals remained funded. The archives remained accessible. The government continued under the principles she had established. Her son and daughter were raised differently from how she had been raised. They were taught royal history, but they were also taught to listen to ordinary people. They were told the story of the snowy road before they were old enough to understand what a crown meant. They learned that their ancestor had once been disowned because she missed a royal engagement. They learned that the reason was not rebellion, selfishness, or pride. It was compassion. The story survived because it was larger than one princess. It was about the moment when a person had to choose between doing what everyone expected and doing what conscience demanded. Eliana chose the stranger. The stranger survived. The kingdom changed. The father eventually understood. The princess became queen. The engagement that once seemed like the most important event in Aurelia's history became almost irrelevant. What mattered was the choice that happened before it. And that is why, centuries later, people still remembered the morning when a royal carriage stopped beside a snowy road. They remembered a princess stepping out of a silver gown and placing her own cloak around a poor old woman. They remembered the palace waiting, the ceremony passing without her, and the father who believed she had thrown away her future. They remembered the secret that followed, the corruption that was exposed, and the kingdom that was rebuilt. Most importantly, they remembered that the future Eliana lost that morning is never truly hers. It had been designed by other people. The future she gained was the one she chose herself. She did not become a great queen because she was born a princess. She became a great queen because, when nobody was watching, she chose to treat one forgotten human life as though it mattered. In the end, the poor old woman had not taken Eliana away from her destiny. She had led her directly toward it. And the princess who missed her royal engagement did not lose her crown that winter morning. She discovered what the crown was supposed to mean.